Some of you may know that my hobby is photography, and one of the most important things in taking a picture is called a focal point. Focal point, really, to summarize, is you want to get in your picture what's really important. This morning, the parable that Michael read to us from the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Luke is a little like a camera. And it has a focal point. And this focal point is compassion. And this parable is a reminder, too, that compassion is at the very core, at the very heart and soul of Jesus' life and his public ministry. And for today's followers and the institutional church, compassion remains central to Christian teachings, especially for the everyday faith and everyday life. Now, some of you may be thinking, you've heard me preaching about compassion before. Perhaps some of you will be thinking that's ho-hum. It's old hat. Maybe at this moment you're thinking that, well, maybe while the preacher's up there preaching, I'll get my supper menu ready in my head. Maybe some of us might be thinking about last night's hockey game, as dismal as those results were. But before you switch monitors, let me remind you that contrary to popular belief, compassion is not some sort of soft, weak-kneed, impractical sort of thing. Let us remember that compassion is a cherished Christian and religious value. Compassion, quite rightly, conjures up reactions about what another person might feel, and empathy, what it's like to walk a mile in another person's shoes. Maybe you think of compassion as being a synonym for tenderness or caring or kindness. Compassion is all those things, but it's more than that. Compassion, genuine compassion, as it's found in the New Testament, has a passion about it and a fierceness about it as well. And we can find that fierceness in the public expression of compassion. We can find it in social justice. The late Marcus Borg, one of the great New Testament scholars and historians of the 20th century, has pointed out in his many books and his many essays and many seminars that we must remember Jesus' passion for justice, social justice. Jesus knew, he points out, that compassion without justice too easily gets individualized, too easily gets sentimentalized. Jesus linked together the ideas of compassion and justice. One of the problems, as Borg points out, is this idea of justice as being misunderstood or not understood at all by the church, by church members. Church members sometimes have a rather fuzzy concept of the idea of biblical justice. We tend to think that justice is about bad people being punished for their sins, punished for their crimes. We sometimes think that justice has to do with the idea of people getting what they deserve for doing stuff that's wrong. Maybe we think that justice is the opposite of mercy and compassion. But that's not what the Bible says anywhere in the New Testament or the Old Testament. In the Bible, the opposite of justice is not mercy, it's not compassion. Instead, in the Scriptures, the opposite of justice is injustice. And injustice has to do with the way we organize things for our society, the way we organize our politics, the way we organize our economics, the way our religious and other systems are structured. Like ancient Israel's prophets before him, Jesus' passion for social justice set him over and against a rich and powerful minority in Galilee and especially in Judea. A rich and powerful minority who set up religious and social and economic and political systems to feather their own nests and give them more and more power. And they did that at the expense of the great majority of the population who are desperately poor, people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable. And also, like the prophets before him, Jesus became God's voice for compassion. And if we read the New Testament carefully, the Gospels carefully, you will see that he was an advocate for justice for the people at the bottom of the social heap. In doing so, he made it clear that God's justice is about everybody having enough to eat, enough to live with dignity and decency. That in itself took aim at the few at the top who are benefiting from the systems they had designed and constructed to serve their own narrow-minded and selfish interests at the expense of the great majority. That's the way things were when Jesus was going about his public ministry. The hard fact is, Jesus' passion for compassion, Jesus' passion for social justice is what got him killed. Lent is a reminder that Jesus did not die a natural death. Instead, the authorities, this minority, executed him because of his advocacy for social justice and because of his critique of an elite who held power over the majority. In Jesus' advocacy on behalf of the Judean and Galilean peasants, in his caring and kindness for what the scriptures describe as the least of these, we can see what he meant when he instructed his disciples to be compassionate as God is compassionate. In other words, we can see the connection, the linkage between compassion and justice. And we can see that social justice is a social form of compassion. Like Jesus, we who gather in his name and in his community are called to be both compassionate and passionate for social justice. There are no ands, ifs, or buts, or exceptions to that rule. That means that it's not enough for you and me just to think about these religious and moral values. Not enough simply to nod our heads in quiet agreement. Not enough to say, well, it's great theory, but not very practical. If we take Jesus seriously, we have to get busy. We have to actively do compassion. We have to actively do social justice. Or to come at this from a slightly different angle, we have to remember that compassion and social justice are verbs, action words. And this morning's gospel reading, Jesus' parable of the barren fig tree in Luke 13, is an excellent example of exactly that. So I'd like to take a moment to sort of unpack what Michael read in those few verses this morning. In this story, two men are talking. One of them is a man who has a fig tree growing in his yard. The other is a vine keeper. Now, when people who were listening to Jesus tell this story originally, they would have known right off the bat who the vine keeper and who the person doing all the talking and demanding represented. They'd have known right off the bat that the vineyard that Jesus referred to was a vast estate. It was owned by the owner, an absentee owner, who probably lived in the city and only came to check on things once or twice a year just to make sure he could maximize his profits. Vinekeeper, on the other hand, was his employee, probably a displaced peasant or even a slave. And since the wealthy owner of the estate is only interested in money, only interested in maximizing his profits, he orders the vinekeeper to cut down the fig tree. And it wants it cut down because it's not producing any fruit and it's not making him any money. There's a hardness, there's a harshness, and a greediness in the estate owner's character. But surprisingly, and this would have been very surprising to the people of Jesus' time, the vinekeeper stands up to the estate owner. He sticks up for the unproductive fig tree. He asks for it to be given another chance to produce fruit that he will work very hard at. He will dig around it. He will spread fertilizer. He will do all the things that a fig tree needs to become productive. And in Israel's history, this is very important. Foreign landlords and absentee landlords wanted the fig tree to produce immediately. But in Israel's laws, you could not use the figs or harvest the figs for at least 3 years. And so, the vinekeeper is keeping the Jewish law. Now, we don't know how the story ends. We don't know if the owner of the estate said, go ahead, or he said, cut it down. We don't know. But one thing we do know, and Jesus makes clear, is that this slave, the vinekeeper, a desperately poor peasant, stands up with a fierceness of compassion and courage and demands justice for the fig tree and for the law of Israel. For doing that, he put himself in great jeopardy for what the estate owner would have considered his insolence. He could have been punished quite severely. So there, in a nutshell, is an example of the linkage of compassion and social justice. Those two things that were central to Jesus' public ministry and a model for us today as Jesus followers and disciples and as Jesus community, something for us to build our modern, everyday ministry in the world. What does all this have to do with us who have gathered here this morning? Now, we do live in a world very different from the world Jesus lived in. Very different world than the author of Luke's gospel lived in. But Jesus' parable of the barren fig tree some 2,000 years ago still talks to us. It still speaks to us in a very real way. First, it reminds you and me as persons of faith. It reminds us as a church, as a community of faith, that we have some very important tools in our toolbox. And those tools are compassion, kindness, caring, mercy, empathy, gentleness, understanding, and love. And if you and I are willing to put these tools to work, we can change ourselves and our own little corners of the world for the better. Second, the parable of the barren fig tree reminds us that the compassion Jesus stood for and advocated still calls people and communities of faith and goodwill to struggle against injustice, to struggle against anything that is unjust. Today, the sad fact is, we're living in a world where the things I've just named, things like compassion and mercy and love and justice, are seen as weaknesses to be exploited. We live in a world bedeviled by war wars of indescribable brutality in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan. And the really great tragedy is that the majority of world's people don't seem to care. Most people see the news and they shrug. We're apathetic, we're indifferent. And there are even those who are just plain selfish and want to know how they can make a buck. We live in a world where Bible passages are taken out of context to validate racism, homophobia, sexism, prejudice, discrimination, and to bless phony religion and unhealthy public policy. Unhealthy public policy like denying the importance of vaccines, and you're making irrational claims. We know that measles and polio just a few years ago in my lifetime were considered eradicated, but they're back. It seems to me that our world today needs Christian social justice. The world today needs us. It needs people of faith and goodwill to take action, to struggle for truth and honesty and equality and equity and fairness. It needs us to struggle for inclusion and the breaking down of barriers that divide rather than unify. And third, compassion and justice that Jesus preached and stood for. Before you give your life over to that, you should know it's no cakewalk. It's not a cakewalk. It's not easy. Do not think for 1 minute, as my generation did a few years ago, that compassion and social justice are some sort of 1960s Yorkville touchy-feely, wear flowers in your hair and hug everybody you meet sort of thing. That has nothing to do with compassion and social justice. Far from it. Compassion and social justice are hard. They're hard because sooner or later the compassionate person or the advocate of social justice is going to be in conflict with the world's unhealthy and destructive, yet taken for granted values. And when that happens, it hurts, and it hurts a lot. And that's not all. It's going to make you really angry. It'll make you angry because you're going to discover things that'll break your heart. For example, you will discover in the world in which we live right now, every year, 15 million children under the age of 5 die. 15 million. That's 14,000 kids under 5 a day. Each day, 11 kids under 5 die. Every day of every year. That's heartbreaking. And it's going to make you angry because you're going to discover the people you were hoping would be there with you and for you and to do something about it. Something to help some of these kids. Don't lift a finger. A few do, most don't. And that's just one example of the cost of being a compassionate person and an advocate of social justice. I could list many, many more. But I'll conclude this morning's remarks by pointing out that Jesus' parable of the fig tree is a reminder that in the 21st century, the church's role is less and less about propagating outdated, tired, and outworn religious beliefs, and a lot more about enabling people to do extraordinary things, because at the very heart of the church is Jesus. Jesus is the one who reminds us that in his life, compassion and justice, and in our lives, are the action words that must be at the center of mission and ministry. So may it be. Amen. May the love of God embrace you, the way of Jesus challenge you, and the wisdom of the Spirit renew you.